I don't know if you folks remember, but I was here a few years ago, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago. And if you want to leave now, I get it if you were here then. I was back here. You were saying it's about 2012 because you invited me and then you didn't show up. No, it's a true story. I was here and I have the privilege of speaking to World Affairs Councils all over. It's not that I have a special gig with them. I just actually love hearing from people out all around the country. I've been to places like Dubuque, Iowa. I've been to Casper, Wyoming, Bartlesville, Oklahoma, where my family is from. Places where there are real people that have, like many of you, served in the Foreign Service or been in the military, done business around the world, or just like to go on trips everywhere and know this is a good place to get discount deals from friends. So I remember that my three favorite places speaking. I had no idea when Dave contacted me again to come back that I'd ever come back to this place. It always was so cool to me. The Buffalo Bills buried down the road, and Buffalo. You guys are all jaded with the Buffalo. We love the Buffalo Bills, and I love being in this club. I love the Casper, Wyoming club, and there's a club in Tulsa. And I would always tell people, in Golden, Colorado, and in Tulsa, and in Casper, and it made me sound cool, like I was connected to real people. So thank you so much. And I was down in Colorado Springs today, and there's another gentleman down there, some of you may know, Sky Forster, who used to be in Pittsburgh. He does outstanding programs for high school students, connecting people to these big questions and big issues, and I really admire what they do. So he said, will you come down to Colorado Springs? And he pulled a Joe Shaw on me. He's now very happy on a cruise ship down to Cuba. It's what I call a humble brag, what he does. In any case, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm going to talk about 30 minutes, but I really would like to have a conversation with all of you. True story. I was told by a number of people, whispering, said, Steve, you appear on MSNBC, and I have a lot of conservatives here tonight. And I'm saying, well, I'm conservative at night, and I'm very progressive and liberal during the day. So I can play both sides of it really well, and look forward to that. And I'm willing to take on any question beyond foreign policy. I'm one of these name-dropping, cocktail party-loving, inside the DC bubble types, and admit it. So we might as well make the most of it. As I tell people, George Washington became president largely out of a bunch of really good beer parties. So that's where a lot of things happen, and I may make reference to that, and I may mention names that seem very easy for me to know. But if there's anything that I mentioned or stop and you said, well, I don't know what he's talking about, just raise your hand. Interrupt me, doesn't matter. I'm happy to do that. Dave is filming it all, so you're on film as well. And by the way, thanks to Dave Shaw, right? It's Dave Shaw. That's your son. He's doing the filming. He's from Fairbanks, Alaska. To give you a little bit about my background, not to go in great detail, I was an Air Force brat. My parents were from Bartlesville, Oklahoma. If anybody from Bartlesville or want to admit it, that's really cool. But my dad was in the military, so never really lived there. I have dozens and dozens and dozens, scores of cousins in Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. And they've always been a kind of touch point for me, particularly in fragile political times, because there's no MSNBC contributor with a family profile I've got. So just put it there for a moment. But I was in the first and second grade in Allison Air Force Base in Fairbanks, Alaska, where he now leads photographic trips and all that, and you can advertise as well. But you brought back to mind that I've had the privilege of living a lot of places. I graduated from high school in Japan, been in Asia, lived in Europe, and I have a life that enables me to go around the world like many of you do, and take the temperature of things and how the rest of the world is seeing us. Sometimes it's good to get an offshore view of what the United States is doing for good and for bad, and we can talk a little bit about that. So I lost my passport recently. Thank God I lost it right before the government shut down. I was going into Europe, and it was either lost or stolen. To this day, I got on a United flight to Frankfurt, was on my way to Budapest, and then to Slovakia for a NATO security forum in Slovakia. And I got there, and I didn't have a passport. I had a passport when I got on. What do you do? And so I made my way through German police, got emergency travel documents. The consular officials in Hungary were magnificent to me. They opened up. Well, they weren't magnificent at the beginning until I told Cloud. People asked me, how's the media doing with Donald Trump? And I am one of the people that is doing really well by Donald Trump, because I called the White House and I asked for my friend Hogan Gidley. Hogan is a the principal deputy press secretary to the president right now, just beneath Sarah Sanders. He used to run the Huck Pack for Mike Huckabee. And I said, Hogan, I need to get to Golden, Colorado. I can't get back into America without a passport. I need your help because my passport's gone. And he says, well, if you're going to Golden, he says, I'll help you get a passport, which they did. I got a temporary passport. And I was joking about Golden, but kind of serious. And then he kind of joked back, and maybe he was semi-serious. And he says, you know, ask for resumes. We need a chief of staff. We got a lot of It's the kind of place that we're comfortable with. So anyway, you can see me after. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. I thought, you know, when Dave asked me for a title of this thing, I was sort of tired of talking about the Trump administration foreign policy or, you know, as the world turns or these things. But, you know, a few years ago when I was running a think tank, to give you my background, I've worked on both sides of the aisle, kind of. I've always been an independent, political independent, as long as I can remember, kind of a pox on both houses, if you will. You know, when I lived in Los Angeles and went to UCLA, it's when Tom Bradley was mayor and the city council at that time had, you know, kind of in a very corrupt way signed off on oil drilling leases for Occidental Petroleum and Pacific Palisades. Did not make me happy. Just, I was fed up with the Democrats at that moment. You know, the Democrats were bad in my book at that moment. Then the Republicans caught up. I helped a gentleman, John Morris, is that right? Jim Morris? John Morris is over here, came up and asked me if I knew Chalmers Johnson. Years ago out of UCLA, I co-founded with Chalmers Johnson, you don't have to know his name, it was a virtual think tank called the Japan Policy Research Institute. And we did a ton of work together. And weirdly, Steve Clemons, little kind of iconoclastic rebel to everyone, bites the hand that constantly feeds me, met President Nixon. It was a match made in heaven, I tell you. He was still alive. He was doing things. And, you know, the world was coming apart in a certain way. The Cold War was ending. And you had, in a certain time, geostrategic thinkers like Henry Kissinger who really couldn't understand why Japan was becoming then a powerful nation, didn't understand the throw weight of an economy, if you will, as opposed to the throw weight of missiles. And there were people like Chalmers Johnson thinking about political economy and competitive economies and how to organize a state in very interesting ways. And so, make a long story short, Bill Clinton had just been elected. Nixon was worried about Russia. So back to Russia for a moment. And Russia melting down. Yeltsin was president. Russia was in dire straits. And the first thing Bill Clinton began doing was calling President Nixon right after he'd been elected, saying, what do we do about Russia? And he became convinced that Japan, which was still technically at war with the Russians, many of you know the legal stuff, you're all State Department lawyer types, but you know, still at war with the Russians / Soviet, pre-Soviets, since World War II. And so they weren't a likely candidate to provide an international aid instrument, but neither was the United States at that particular moment. We were in a lot of economic doldrums, had problems at the same time. And so Nixon just got it in his mind he was going to go to Japan, get the money, do something symbolic for Russia, and hired me to help him. So I organized Nixon's last trip to Japan and Korea, and we met the kind of shadow shogun of Japanese politics. It all worked out. And then he said, how do you want to be the director of my new public policy center in Washington? And so I joined the Nixon Library, which I just want to say that because a lot of the other stuff I'm going to say tonight may not be as friendly on the public, but just give me a few credits, okay? And so I was the first executive director of the Nixon Center in Washington. I brought Chalmers Johnson onto the board. I told Nixon I would only do it if it were credibly bipartisan and if we dealt with economic issues as well as other kinds of national security issues, traditional geostrategic issues. And the economic issues going back to that time in kind of a Rip Van Winkle way is important because I told Nixon and Kissinger and others that were on my board, John McCain was on my board, was a wonderful, wonderful supporter of mine. We needed to think through, as globalization was taking hold, as Bill Clinton-style globalization was taking hold, where anything that was good for multinational was apparently good for America in his mind, I said you had to think about the national dimensions of America's economic interests and how to make those work. That conversation has come back today, and I just want you to remember that for a moment. I then got hired from them to work for Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico. Anybody know Jeff? Anybody friends? Isn't Jeff wonderful? Smartest guy. My job was to get in the media. He hated being in the media. But I was his senior economic advisor and foreign affairs advisor. And Ann Bingaman, his wife, who was a former head of antitrust, used to go around in her voice. You knew Ann well, some of you? You know her voice? She used to say, the bravest thing that my husband ever did was hire Steve Clemons from the budget of Richard Nixon. So anyway, I joined Jeff's staff. I can't do it quite as well without sake or something. But so I worked for Jeff Bingaman in the Senate in the 1990s, then worked on trade and economic issues for a man named Clyde Prestowitz. Bob Lighthizer was one of the organizers of some of our biggest funding. Bob is now the president's U.S. trade representative. The other big steel mogul in Washington, other than Bob Lighthizer, was a man named Alan Wolf. And no one's done this story yet. It's one I'm waiting to do when I get time. Alan Wolf today, who was a former deputy U.S. trade representative ages ago, is now today the deputy director general of the World Trade Organization. So get that. At this moment, the two great giants of steel 20 years ago, Bob Lighthizer and Alan Wolf, both funders of mine, are now rivals over trade and whether America is going to be in the WTO, still talking steel. It's weird how things keep coming back in circles. But it's something else. So I did that, and I co-founded a think tank called the New America Foundation, which was a centrist think tank. We called ourselves the Politics of the Radical Center, if you will. Not so much anymore. Anne-Marie Slaughter heads it up, and I love Anne-Marie, but it's not in the same place where we were before. And then about 8 years ago, I joined the Atlantic. I'd been involved with the Atlantic for a few years before that, but had become part of their editorial team and the team that helped turn the Atlantic from a wonderful place of letters and culture and humor and politics, founded in 1857 and losing $11 million a year, into a highly profitable place for letters and long form, and it's doing really, really well today. But at the time, it wasn't. We had about 300,000 unique readers a month when I joined. We now have 45 million unique readers a month today. So the Atlantic is here. There was this, this is maybe the wrong audience. I don't know. Maybe some of you watch. Anybody see the latest edition of RoboCop? No, the movie? Well, if you were to rent it on Netflix, I mean, I know many of you have seen it, just don't want to admit it in this crowd. But there's an actor, Samuel Jackson. RoboCop is the guy, the cop of the future, whatever. And it's a crappy movie, so really don't. The only thing you want to watch it is Samuel Jackson is in there. This is way in the future, the fictional future. And he's standing in there about whether we can have machines and AI and the connection of everything running on their own without human beings, or whether you still need a pilot in the plane kind of debate. And he's walking out on a stage, and there's a giant screen with one of the screens is the Scientific American, which is also a very old publication, and the other is the Atlantic. And Ta-Nehisi Coates sent us all a note saying, "I saw RoboCop last night. I've seen the future, and we are in it." So that's a little bit about where we're coming in. Let's talk. Let's talk about the world. So I had titled this about America kicking down its own hill. America as king of the hill, kicking down its own hill. And I want to share with you some perspectives that I have, but I also want to be respectful of the fact that I think there are a lot of different views, and I'm going to go back to this Chalmers-Johnson issue for a moment a couple of times tonight, which I'll explain, to sort of say you can have different people from different perspectives. Political flavor has less to do with it rather than some of the questions about how people see the role and purpose of America in the world, how people see what they're willing to pay for and ending up for, how they see what their legacy of contact with the global world has been. That's why I value World Affairs Council so much, and all you do for the young people that you inspire, the high school students. I would love to be there for that. I want to go down and do an international component for the National Western Stock Show, which I've been seeing a lot of. There's going to be a cowboy literature and poetry reading in a couple of days. I wish I were going to stay around for that. But you see different people looking at different incidents. Let me just ask you guys to not be shy, and let's just do something here for a minute. I would like to ask you about Syria for a minute, because we're going to come back to this later. I just want to know how many of you, forget how we did or whatever, how many of you support American military presence in Syria? Forget all the details, but support. Put your hands up. Okay. How many people do not think that American troops deployed in Syria is a smart course, and that getting out of Syria in the near term is a smart course? So I appreciate all of that candor. I'm going to come back to that. I asked the same thing down in Colorado Springs today, and we had roughly 40%, if I was judging right, were stay, and about 60% go. So a little bit different than this room, but it shows one of the things that's very important is all of you are respectful of each other. All of you are in the same organization. All of you have a very different view. And it's one of the interesting things I want to raise, that as we struggle about what the right foreign policy and national security is, what the role of media is in reporting, I think there's a lot of shenanigans going on with how we tell stories, how we pin responsibility, what the real issues are. Is the real issue staying in Syria or leaving Syria, or is it how you treat allies and how you treat others? Are there human dimensions and emotional dimensions that matter as much in some of these cases as the actual underlying substance? And that's what I want to try to talk about this evening with you in this issue of kicking down the hill. A friend of mine, Anatole Lieben, years ago that I'd hired at New America Foundation, wrote this book, and it was around the George W. Bush administration, which he thought at that time was absolutely the worst administration he'd ever seen. Yeah, it's kind of like that Will Ferrell cartoon where he's dressing up in George Bush and he goes up in front of the crowd and says, "Miss me yet?" But in this book that Anatole wrote called America, Right or Wrong, he wrote about what was progressive realism. I see myself as sort of a realist. But he talked a little bit about America after the infrastructure that we built around the world, both in real terms, in roads, bridges, infrastructure, but also global institutions, the institutions of diplomacy, the watchdog organizations in Europe, the OECD, the international energy agencies, NATO, and on, the various IAEA, UN, UNESCO, etc., many of which you've been involved with. That architecture essentially made America the king of the hill at that time. And he saw us at that time ripping away. I remember some of us were talking about Senator Tim Worth. In 2005, I'm getting to the point where I don't want to say many of you were there yet, but I'm like going, that seems like yesterday. But 2005, when I was blogging in my blog, The Washington Note, I've written more about John Bolton than any American alive. I wrote a daily article about him. Tim Worth at the UN Foundation was a big funder of my blog, and thrilled to read The Washington Note every day. And John, whom I knew and respected his service to the country, I respected things that he had done on proliferation security. I thought he was the wrong guy at the wrong moment for the United States as the UN, and I was exercising my democratic rights by writing about the things about him in a very high road way, and reminding the country that we're sending someone to the UN that was not carrying the same message that George Bush, because I want to tell you, I gave George Bush a glowing praise after he'd beaten John Kerry, and he gave this amazing talk in Brussels, where President Bush, George W., had said that the age that we needed to get out of these unilateralist moves, we needed to get back to reconnecting with the aspirations of the world, deal with the problem solving. Of course, George W. Bush hired my friend Mark Dybul and became, as the HIV/AIDS ambassador in Africa, did incredible things in many other parts of the world, and so there are things out there. But in my view, John Bolton was not going to be a constructive contributor to the Bush legacy on rebuilding a kind of non-unilateral side. And when Bolton didn't get confirmed, that's a fun story, which I'd love to tell you over drinks if you want. I always knew he would be back. And he's back with someone who is representing, I think, a very interesting moment. And we have to ask ourselves, and I said in Colorado Springs today, we're all focused on what feels like an inflection point in history. It is an inflection point in history. We're seeing in the notions about America First, about removing a kind of strategic contraction of the United States from a lot of the obligations it has traditionally held, a reorientation and a reweighting of things. But believe me, it didn't start with President Trump. It started way before. It didn't even start with President George W. Bush. It started before that. That there were things that got embedded in the process of dealing with this. And I use the example today of my brother and of my many cousins. 97 of 100 voted for President Trump, and I've been interviewing them and talking to them to try and understand where they come from, on how how do they see the world? And I haven't told them whether I support it or not. I had my concerns about Secretary Clinton running and others. But what was interesting is almost at 100%, every cluster of families that I have been interviewing are military families in the Midwest. So they have a legacy of service in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all other kinds of military service and conflict. I'm sure that many of your families are the same way. And like my brother, joined, was not college educated, enlisted person, deployed in various bases, but came out and then became a technician for HP, was laid off several times, trained his Indian successor. It was incredibly harmful to his life and psyche and to his wife. And trained and then got job training and became a healthcare person, is now working in an elder care facility, which he loves, but he makes $27 an hour, and it cost him about $70,000 to get schooled for that service. That's crazy. That's not a good way to move service, retrain service. But when you look through at the 2008-2009 financial crisis, when you look through some of the economic hardships that have hit many people that feel left behind, demeaned, and neglected, those folks didn't ever deserve that, but it's part of the equation of the country. And that came apart as a result, not just of the Iraq War, but of a kind of what I would call, when I worked in the Senate, we were worried about those folks, but the IT industry was growing so quickly, new jobs were being added so quickly. President Clinton's administration didn't really want to invest in trying to figure out how can we get job training right, how can we subsidize that in a way that's much more dramatic. So when you look back at the sense of the broken quid pro quo that Americans felt between America's doing great things in the world and them getting a benefit of that funny adage we laughed about we fought the Cold War and China won, for them that's a real thing. It's a joke in the Northeast, but it's a real thing for many people. And I tell folks when they think about global affairs, what's going on, America as a king of the hill in that process, is that we've had a lot of erosion of the social contract in the United States. That drove Bernie Sanders' campaign. That clearly drove Donald Trump's campaign. And in that, we're building a foreign policy and a national security strategy in that space. And it's very different than it used to be. Because it's very important to go beyond and look at other things that came along. So when the Iraq War came in my view, is something I was very opposed to. Why was I opposed to the Iraq War? I'm not a pacifist. I believe in the deployment of power. I thought whether I thought the intel was right or wrong, I had been studying, like the gentleman had mentioned about Chalmers Johnson, the radicalizing effect of certain bases in the world. I had been in South Korea, and I had seen Molotov cocktails, massive student protests of U.S. bases in South Korea. It wasn't on the map in Washington at all. But you go there, and they were serious. At least they were, good actors. And, I did not go to Saudi Arabia and knew the bases, but I could read and was reading. I always read translations of foreign and international press so that I didn't get stuck in the bubble of the New York Times or the Post. But I would read the Arabic press from various places, the populist Arabic press, infuriated about the U.S. bases deployed and still in Saudi Arabia long after the first Gulf War. And so there was a blind spot in my view. It may not be your views, because I know there are a lot of people in the military here, and I respect that. My dad was in the Air Force. Eielson Air Force Base was not radicalizing. It was a very good base to be from. But there are certain bases that, rather than being anchors of stability in the region, could equally be destabilizers in the region. And I met a guy named Peter Bergen, whom I hired at the New American Foundation. He was CNN's terrorism analyst. He found Osama bin Laden in 1997, did the famous interview with him. And so I hired Peter before 9/11. I was interested in what was going on in the Middle East, what was going on with these kind of terror groups we were hearing more about, and what was our blind spot in dealing with this. And this raises the interesting question that I will jump into Donald Trump on Syria, is sometimes troops are helpful. Sometimes troops can help. Sometimes they become fig leaves for bad things. Sometimes they allow you to educate women and to provide other services and to get other things in. It depends on what the mix is. But I think with regards to the Iraq War, what ended up happening as a result of the Iraq War, going in and chasing a beast into Saddam Hussein and others, is America, as a superpower, managed to show limits. This is something Chalmers Johnson and I talked a lot about. is our blind spot that that superpowers have so much hubris that they don't understand that being a superpower is kind of magic. There's a certain elixir in being a superpower that most of the world can't see your limits. They don't know what you can't do. They don't think there's anything you can't buy your way out of, invent your way out of, or fight your way out of, because you have more power than any other power. You could go to England and France, or you could go to Indonesia or Papua New Guinea. It didn't matter, developed world or developing world, and everybody looked at America as an unbelievably unique place with almost no limits. The Iraq War, no matter whether you were for it or against it, the result of it was it managed to show the military limits of the United States. It managed to end up kicking off the economic limits of the United States in the form of the 08-09 financial crisis. So when you're a power and you show those limits to the world, the subprime crisis, what went on in Iraq, the first consequence is your allies won't count on you as much on their dark days. Allies change their behavior. And then your enemies, figure it out, and they'll move their agendas forward because they want to move while you're weak. What happens is we went from being relatively stable, maybe living on fumes of an old order that was going to die anyway, to a world that became overnight radically fragile. Saudi Arabia's behavior changed, Israel's behavior changed, Japan's behavior changed, Germany's behavior changed. Those were our closest pals in the world. And then you could go to many others, and behavior changed around the world. And so today we're still in this mucky period of instability and whatnot. So I wanted to mention that. Then I'll jump ahead a little bit more. President Obama. Some of you may have read Jeff Goldberg's incredible piece on Barack Obama at one point called the Obama Doctrine. And he's a strategically cautious guy. He was not a Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was ready to, like Madeleine Albright, deploy force, achieve good ends, go and chase causes. And there's good in that and bad in that. And there's good and bad in Barack Obama. But Donald Trump was much more cautious, much more even than Obama. And it was clear to me from day one. The people worried about more wars. I mean, he didn't like the bases that we've got around the world. In a way, he must have read Chalmers Johnson's book called Blowback, the Costs and Consequences of the American Empire, and said, maybe we ought to take some of that back. The whole reading. You get the first question, because you're funny. So in any case, there is a lot out there about the world right now. And I think we're at a point where there is strategic contraction. You do see the rise of China. You see players like Iran, North Korea, and Russia mattering in ways that they didn't used to matter. And this is all a part of the fragility that we have today. And we're going to have to renegotiate our place in the world. We're going to have to renegotiate what a global social contract that work means internationally with these other players. That means I better be quiet soon. And we're going to have to get back to looking at your international institutions and whether they measure up. I'm going to just do a really quick run through some of the big issues that I think matter, and then I want to really hear from you, and let's have a conversation. I mean, it's a great room of expertise and passion, I know, in the room. And Ann Moore, we're talking about, you did with studying with people here. You changed the game for developing nations, for women all around the world. And in development, when you look, it's up there with mosquito nets or maybe more. I met this guy the other day, by the way. You know CAPTCHA, when you type in those squiggly letters? I met the inventor of CAPTCHA. He's this young guy in Pittsburgh. He has a language learning thing called Dialogio online to teach people for free how to speak foreign languages over your iPhone. And he gave this service away for free. I hope you didn't give away the Snuggly for free. No. But anyway, don't have to go into that. We'll get to that later. Just tell me. But let's kind of do a quick run. China. So we talked a little bit about what's going on in trade right now, and I want to give you just the Steve Clemons view of the world. I do think China is has been a predatory, mercantilist nation that has fueled much of its growth by being a predator in many other economies in the world. it doesn't change the fact that it's now joined at the hip with the United States and many other countries. And it's pumping, I've talked to Bono, not to name drop, but I do name drop. But, Bono is basically saying, look, the tents in our aid camps are all made in China. The brand names that are coming into China or into Africa, and a lot of the things that he's doing are all in China. That the American brand is slipping and disappearing even when it's trying to do good things. It's something to think about. That said about China, we have to have a way forward. And my critique of Donald Trump and Bob Lighthizer and his anti-trade fanatic Peter Navarro, that's about as mean as I'll get tonight on anybody, is they don't have a game plan that we all understand. It's not just to bash China, or it's not just to sanction a country. We'll have to see what they come out with, and whether or not there's some new rules of the road, patterns of behavior, habits and frames that become usable with other trading partners, or that become usable with other allies, if we still have them, in their own trading relations. All of this has to become, in my view, if we're going to reset norms, then reset them. But that means you have to implicate your team and the government with them so that they're all on the same page. And then we eventually have to be able to know what's behind box B, rather than just guessing. My critique with Donald Trump is more about, I don't mind a disruptive president or even a wrecking ball president. I do mind a president that doesn't let us know where we're going and what we're seeking to achieve. And that is my biggest and most profound criticism of both Trump and his team. And his team have a hard time. His team should be up here giving this talk because they don't know what their president is doing. And I think that is one of the things that's going on in trade and national security. But one of the interesting things is that he is using a kind of mercantilist American style right now. He's shaking down our allies over steel and autos. Canada and Mexico are, there were things built into the global trading system that probably needed to shake up. This is where I'm going to go, good and bad. The good side is, if you want to, change things, that the patterns of behavior in trade are bad, shake them up, but then let's have a vision. So I support, as I have for the last 20 years, some of this going on, but not to the degree that would upend, not to a fanatical degree that it would upend American agriculture at all levels. I feel the same thing about immigration. America has been the brain drain problem of the world for countless generations. That's what's made us rich in ability. I know immigration is complicated. We need to have rules, but it's disingenuous to say, well, we both need to fix immigration at the border, but by the way, we're also going to cut all sorts of upper end immigration and other ends of immigration. When in fact we know that those inputs into the United States and the country, particularly our engineering programs, Bob Gates, who apparently Donald Trump likes, and I have co-written articles years ago about how 9/11 needed to not become a place that it began upending or disrupting us getting the smartest people in the world coming into the United States. Because if we didn't do that, smart firms will begin putting research centers where they were and chasing those folks. That largely began to happen. The Boeings of the world put air flight centers in Shanghai. Intel put research and design facilities in Tianjin and Shanghai. And you began to see a lot of our R&D base, which was really the creme de la creme of the American economy, move abroad in ways because of our inability or our anxieties about separating good people from bad people. And that was after 9/11. Today, it's far worse. Today, people are self-selecting not to come here at all because they see the situation is so toxic, or they're afraid of guns, or whatever it may be. We can get into some of that one. So China's there. Iran. Iran is apparently John Bolton's hatching war plans for Iran. We'll be back next week to see whether we have that. But Iran is a situation where I did support the JCPOA process. I supported JCPOA plus. I knew the Iranians were so scared of American power after the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq that Javad Zarif, the now foreign minister, but he was the former ambassador to the UN, had put together a white paper that said, we'll talk about Hezbollah, we'll talk about the MEK, we'll talk about terrorism, we'll talk about our bad behaviors, we'll talk about ballistic missiles. And the Bush administration shrugged at it, never responded. So, we've been in a kind of whack-a-mole thing that either they wanted to talk about a grand bargain and then we didn't, or then we did and they didn't want to. So we ended up with a narrow aperture about nuclear weapons because of the fear that within a year we could be at war in a direct collision. But right now it looks as if to some people we're actually seeking that conflict. So I just want to put that into place, and I worry about that. Lots of unexpected things can happen. North Korea, new best buddy. Exchange of letters. Trump will finally finish his term and publish the Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump letters. They will be a bestseller at Christmas, I'm sure. The thing about it, if any of you watched, I do a lot of MSNBC, and when the other bigger names aren't available. So I was up at 2 or 3 in the morning when President Trump visited one of the camps that had been many who've been deployed to South Korea. I can't remember the name of the camp, but I want to keep Camp Hands, but that's not it. But the camp that they had moved our troops away from the DMV to a new camp. And Donald Trump went there, and this was at 3 in the morning, and nobody in the press caught it. But he had given his prepared talks, and at the end of his talk, he said, I would have built this camp on time, under budget, and a lot better job. I would have done a lot better job on this camp. We don't even need this camp. He said, this camp isn't even for us and our security. It's for your security. And he, with that one statement, undermined the whole reason for the trip. The whole reason to the trip to South Korea is to tell the South Koreans, your security is our security. But he did, in that one throwaway phrase, say, your security is not our security, and by the way, you owe us a lot more money for all this stuff. And we're going to run the Pentagon into problem. So, I think that those issues of South Korea and Japan, again, we haven't seen as much of them in the headlines like Canada and Germany, our new enemies, or Mexico. But South Korea and Japan feel very indirectly shafted at the moment by a lot of what's going on. It's good to keep that in mind as we deal with that. Japan plays a really good game of, it's great at kabuki theater because they want very much for the world to think that they're joined at the hip with President Trump. They exchange a lot of golf clubs from former Prime Minister Kishi and Eisenhower and all this stuff. But the bottom line is Japan doesn't trust us. They probably have, there are certain fault lines in the world that are known fault lines where conflict would happen so quickly, escalate so quickly, and we have well-designed playbooks and simulation exercises. And Japan, at that core level, is having to go back and ask, on those dark times, in those moments, can they depend upon the United States? Their biggest pal and friend was Jim Mattis. So Jim Mattis is not there. The new fellow that's just moved in is not one of those folks. And there's no one in the establishment there. But again, come back to good and bad and how people may look at it. We don't know about the acting Secretary of Defense. It'll be interesting to see if Lindsey Graham, whom I like and trust basically, if he gets the job, or if Jim Webb, a former U.S. Senator from Virginia, a Democrat, a former Secretary of the Navy. He's sort of like a Joe Manchin Democrat. I mean, he is a very interesting man, also a good friend, and he would be an interesting guy who's much more in alignment with a Chalmers Johnson. In fact, Chalmers Johnson and Jim Webb were secret friends. I didn't tell him, I'm disclosing that now. So it would be interesting to see that happen. But you have a new designated, for those of you in the military, a new next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley of the Army. I can't think of anyone better. So here's a case, and with all the derision of President Trump, sometimes I say, he managed on a good choice. Mark Milley is one of the best command staff generals and admirals that we have today, and he will be succeeding General Dunford as successor. And he is solid, absolutely rock solid in his perspective. He's an inclusive person. He helped engineer. Now, one of his battles is going to be over things like transgendered service in the military. Golden, Colorado is kind of complicated to bring that up, but it's going to be out there. But Mark Milley was one of the first to move his services towards much more acceptance and also deal with sexual violence in the military. So these kinds of things, there are people out there that I think we can be very proud of and whatnot. I'm going to wrap up real quick. NATO is in trouble. Apparently this week it was reported that Donald Trump had actually told people, why don't we just withdraw from NATO? He doesn't feel the muscle or the need to do that. This is sending shockwaves. Many of you, I was talking to some of you at dinner and in the reception earlier about the fact that our allies look at America as the rogue country in the world today. And that's a problem, and it doesn't need to be that way. That we could actually reform NATO, redesign NATO, begin thinking about different pathways to Russia. I was always one that thought we should have provided, and this will be controversial, but Richard Haas, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations, was a guy who wrote the same white paper years ago. We should have provided a pathway for Russian membership within NATO. Otherwise, you're going to be back in an us versus them dynamic. We had a lot of arrogance in the world after the end of the Cold War, and we didn't envision a time where a basket nation could come back, reorganize, and begin trying to create some of the same terms of competition as they had in the past. And so we're at that. But NATO has a purpose. But again, on the good side, NATO has a lot of inertia built into it. And I, at the New America Foundation, organized a whole bunch of forums on why do we need NATO. This was 12 years ago. I can pull them out. So we were in the think tank community saying NATO has no purpose, the world is different, we're not competing with Russia, we need to cooperate with Russia, there are other challenges in the world, why are we spending the kind of money doing this? So it's not illegitimate to ask those questions. And what it should do is force players back into asking why we need an alliance to do that. What were the out-of-country things that we now need to deploy for that we hadn't expected? There's a new way to define this stuff that actually can reinvigorate alliances. Again, my critique of the administration is Mike Pompeo will say that, Jim Mattis was saying that, H.R. McMaster was saying that, even on Tuesdays, John Bolton will say that. But President Trump, you don't know where he's coming. I don't think he feels those alliances deeply enough to do it. But many of his team and many Republicans, conservatives do understand that shaking up these organizations was needed and necessary, not just paying the bills, but figuring out why it's there and what it's for are part of this. Syria, again, a mess. I think one of my things that I come back to when I ask all of you, did you support the president or not support the president on the support? That's not the issue for me. The issue for me is the Kurds were the first to move the needle in fighting ISIS in Syria. There was no success on the ground against ISIS in Syria. We were trying, my boss who owns the Atlantic has been very committed to getting various American and European, both regular people like Kayla Mueller, who was tragically killed. We were working on James Foley, who was beheaded. But Theo Padnos, my boss, David Bradley, got away from al-Nusra with help by organizing to do that. The Kurds were enormously helpful in the process of trying to work with us and their own arrangements. And so when you're fighting and working with someone, it's not that you are going to have that relationship forever, that those training wheels, that those partnerships will be resilient for whatever comes in. But you don't in the dead of night in a binary decision, even though maybe we shouldn't have been there in my book in the first place. But if you were going to be there, you don't abandon your allies in the way we did. And so when I was on MSNBC and being challenged about Mattis and why I was leaving, I said, you hosts haven't studied this. Jim Mattis is not complaining about the policy. Jim Mattis is complaining about the style, the lack of communication coordination, the disrespect, and basically the spitting on allies that we asked to get in this. A similar kind of thing happened early on. It's a behavior of the president, which I think is regrettable, on TPP when we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Asia. Say what you will on trade, say what you will on the TPP, but the TPP, there were political winners and losers throughout Asia because we were bending their arms to get in. We were breaking their China to get in to this. We were forcing them because we saw it at that time as important for our national security to get them in. And then we abandoned the party that we forced everybody to attend. Those kinds of things, that was a foreshock of the kinds of things we could have. And again, if I were sitting and talking to President Trump, I have met him a bunch of times. There's a funny story I can say during Q&A, but he hasn't asked my advice on this yet. When I write or comment, I say, look, I don't have fundamental problems with a lot of where he wants to go with foreign policy and national security or economic nationalism and rethinking. I'd rather it be less about steel and how we make the future right with AI or nanotechnology or industries of the future. Rather not see designer babies designed by CRISPR in China and figure out what rules and norms we need to have internationally and just withdrawing from all those things, whether it's on climate change, whether it's on dealing with how the global economy is going to work, is insane because it makes America, as powerful we as are, it makes America much smaller in dealing with all of this stuff. So I would say simply, as I bring this to a conclusion, there's so much I haven't talked about. Cyber, the Brexit vote today, which I think is going to have its own repercussions. But there is one bit of good lining in this, which is, as Chalmers Johnson, this very interesting public intellectual years ago, no longer with us, and I were talking about, is that the world structures that we created in the 50s no longer work today. And Mike Pompeo gave a blustery speech in Brussels recently, and the Europeans absolutely hated it. They walked out saying, wow, we're not going to be allied with the United States down the road. That's the general feeling. Very good. And I went back to read the speech. Everybody should read it. Because in it, there's lots of seeds of hope. Because in this speech, he talks about why aren't we changing these institutions to reflect the way power works in the world, that reflect the Indias, the Brazils, the other nations in the world that need to be global stakeholders, and rip up these institutions and change things in a way so that we're not held to be prisoners of these anachronistic and ineffective and low traction institutions. I would grab that if I were anyone in the world of influence, if I were out there, if I were all of you talking to young people and say, go into your high school classes, go into your college, write the thesis, begin taking seriously this notion that we may actually be in a position today of where those institutions are much more malleable and changeable than ever before, and that Donald Trump is a long line of folks that have come in and basically pounding at it. But there's an opportunity to redirect those things, because if we don't do it, then we're going to be just in a world of chaos and anarchy and without a Batman. So I think, no one laughed at that. But I do think that there's hope in basically redesigning these moments. Otherwise, the world that we're going to have is going to be so messy, so dark, and we just don't know when it will end. There's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet, other than the hard work of rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how to draw up a new global social contract with partners who matter on issues we all care about. And maybe the positive side of President Trump is that despite why he may be doing it, whether it's Robert Mueller in the Russia investigation, he still may get some credit for shaking things up that way. So why don't I stop there?
The title of your speech has the word America First. The things I've been taught over the years was those were the worst, most vulgar people in America in the late 1930s. They were isolationists. They were anti-Semites.
Yeah.
Now this president we have now...
The 1930s are back.
That's right, they're back. And everything that he talks about is America first, America first. He won't listen to anybody. You don't know from Tuesday what's going to happen on Wednesday.
See, I'm really angry about David Sanger. Some of you know David Sanger, New York Times writer, writes a lot about nuclear issues. He and Maggie Haberman did one of those famous interviews with Donald Trump that ran about 19 pages in the New York Times and had very little structure or coherence. But in it, Donald Trump was trying to talk about, I'm going to joke a little bit about this because he was sort of talking about America slightly ahead, or America needed to be more independent on this stuff. And then it was David Sanger said, sounds to me like you're talking about America first. And then Donald Trump said, yeah, that's right. And then he's used America first. So David Sanger is the one on the New York Times to blame for the framing. But look, your other point is absolutely right. The Atlantic writes a lot about race, social justice, inequality, and the legacies of the past, and what has to happen in the world. What is strange, when you look at what's happening to Theresa May and the Brexit game going on right now in UK, when you look at the rise of populism that Macron and Merkel are both dealing with in Germany and France. I was just in Budapest and I saw those really horrific posters, and I'm happy to talk about them, but I think they're anti-Semitic, absolutely awful, with pictures of George Soros on every bus stop in Budapest that I saw inside Hungary. You go to Slovakia, a place that I weirdly love. I never thought that would take so much of my life, but lately I'm on the board of something there with Michael Chertoff. And in Slovakia, there's a struggle inside that country with a pro-Russian party that largely controls the military there, and then the foreign ministry, Foreign Minister Lajcak and others who essentially associate themselves with the values of Western liberalism and Western democracy in the United States. And we are not there. We're not present as they're feeling more and more. So when I said the 1930s are back, there's a whiff of the 1930s coming back that's been spiked by the immigration crisis. It's been spiked by the fear of others, the fear of terrorism that has come along with this in terms of cells and people who have created fear and anxiety inside societies. All of that is fueling a kind of pugnacious nationalism that is very much like that isolationist, anti-global perspective of the 30s, and it is deeply worrisome. And that's why I go out, not just to broadcast my views to World Affairs Councils, but I want to tell people like you, please help your young people, or go meet your cousins. It's not, or those of you who have influence with President Trump. President Trump can be, look, I know that there are a lot of issues, and I don't want to, sideboard those, but I believe President Trump is a free trade zone that can be captured. by any number of perspectives. I've heard this guy talk very different game depending on who was in the room and change the game. Now, that's unfortunate. I wish it wasn't. The things that he's doubling down on are some of these things that appear stridently consistent with what some of these pugnacious, largely white nationalists want to have. But they're not all that way. My relatives are not that way. My relatives are not bigots in this, but they were shaken up and they hated what they thought Hillary Clinton represented, and they wanted to have a wrecking ball tear apart Washington, and they wanted to see us Northeastern establishment scream because they feel screwed and left behind by them. So I think those people can be won back, and that's the way to disaggregate a lot of this and basically put that 1930 spirit from being 25-30% of the country back down to about 8%, and then we'll be safe. Thank you. It's a great comment. This is John Morris.
Thanks.
Is it John or Jim?
It's John.
Okay, there you go.
Quick question, just
We've never met before, but I just...
very simple. On Asia, do you see Xi Jinping wanting to strike at Japan to have a payback for the 1930s?
No. I'm going to try, I won't be long-winded on this, but since you're the one, John is the one that asked me about Chalmers Johnson and whether I had ever read it, hadn't realized how my DNA and his were swirled together for quite a long time, more than a decade of a daily phone call from Chow, PTSD of its own kind. But Chalmers' view and my view as it evolved, and I say this with all due respect, this will be controversial, believe that U.S. bases in Korea, U.S. bases in Japan, despite providing whatever beneficial security they did, began to become real problems in the region because they became moral hazards, if you will. Because they were there, China knew Japan would never invade. You know, for China, U.S. bases in Japan, as much as they bitched about them, were corks in the bottle of Japanese power. The Koreans knew that they didn't have to get along with Japan because they had their own deal with the U.S. and their own bases, and they didn't really have to get along all that much. They could be nasty on the sidelines with the Japanese because they had U.S. So U.S. bases allowed everyone to flirt with a kind of virulent dark nationalism that was rejectionist of each other because our bases were there. If our bases had not been there, I guarantee you all of those leaders would have been far more cautious and careful with their rhetoric and how they played with historical memory. So if you take those bases out, if you withdraw them, if the landscape changes, Japan and China could just tear each other apart in very nasty ways. Japan has one of the most powerful militaries in the world, kind of tucked under an Article 9 no war clause, which is kind of BS, if you will. It has extraordinary military capacity, as China will. And so they don't want, those are the real powers in the region. South Korea has power too, but nothing like that. The question is what happens not only in that region if the U.S. strategically contracts or people begin to doubt the U.S., what will happen with nuclear weapons and nuclear material. And of course, Japan was, as Henry Kissinger said, one of the most powerful non-declared nuclear nations in the world. It had more weapons-grade plutonium stashed in Japan, allegedly for its reactors, but it was the wrong kind of material you needed. Now, under Obama, it began to ship some of that plutonium back to the United States. But I suspect that age is over, and that right now, the nuclear genie, if we don't manage, unless Kim Jong-un just actually is going to give it all up. How many people think Kim Jong-un is going to give up his nuclear weapons? There we have uniformity. You all agree on one thing. But Mike Pompeo is hopeful. So in that world, I think that, right now, I don't think Xi Jinping has that in mind. But look, again, he wants to be a superpower. I was in Davos a couple of years ago. I was there last year when Donald Trump spoke. I wrote a funny piece, which is in the Atlantic, on how Donald Trump disappointed Davos last year because he was so kind and gentle and, collegial and, people wanted to be in the room when Trump happened, and it didn't happen. He didn't get explosive and obstinate and pugnacious. And he's not going this year. He just canceled because of the government shutdown. But before that, the year before, when I went with Vice President Biden, so we didn't have a president there, but Trump had been elected, and the world was worried about what that meant. And Xi Jinping took over Davos and basically said, first time he'd ever appeared there, and said, "Don't worry, I will protect the global trading and the global economy, the economic order, and I will deliver on climate change. I will make sure that the world does not burn up, that we will continue on our course on that." So in one move, whether you believe China or not, China ascended to the mantle of pretending to take responsibility in ways for these great global public goods challenges we have, while there was doubt about the United States. And I think that Xi Jinping wants to stay very much on that course and to develop the kind of mystique of power, technology, innovation, economy, and whatnot that the United States previously had. And so he's going to be very reticent, and the Chinese leadership is going to be very reticent about actually deploying power. Because when you deploy power, you actually show limits. That's the kind of weird catch-22 of military force in the world. If it doesn't go well, or you get stuck in a quagmire, your stock falls in the eyes of other nations in the world.
I have a question in the center here, and then I'll go to the other.
Okay, great.
So just to go back to the first question, and this kind of cyclical thing we're seeing in the world with going back to these things from the 30s and this conservatism or worse. I mean, we talk a lot about what's happening here.
I don't think it's conservatism, just because I want to make my conservative friends in Golden, Colorado comfortable.
But this viewpoint.
It's a strident, pugnacious nationalism.
Right, and the nationalism, and we talk a lot about it, how it's happening here, but frankly, it's all around the world.
It's all around the world.
Why do you think at this point in time that we're seeing this, it's almost anthropological?
Well, I think in the developed world, the Western developed world, something happens simultaneously, and that is that others can communicate this much better than I can. We got in a very bad spot in the business cycle, and the subprime crisis, which was a corruption of our economic system, had enormous international ramifications. Lots of people were shoved down the economic scale because of things that happened here. We were supposed to be the perfect economy, the creme de la creme economy that told other economies how to organize. When Tim Geithner was Secretary of the Treasury, I asked him, after this happened, and you're going around and telling Indonesia how to organize its economy, or India how to organize its economy, how's that going? Or do they say, oh, you did such a good job with yours? So what ended up happening as a result of that is both the tendencies towards inequality all around in all these developed market economies that are very wealthy, but and a kind of built-in thing that we saw in Europe, or we saw in the Greek crisis, and we saw in the southern part of Europe, other economies being left behind and demeaned in the process. You know, Germany grew enormously and successfully in a disciplined way because it was able to connect itself to Chinese growth in a way that others inside Europe didn't. But that became a point of arrogance versus many other nations inside Europe. So this was a beggar thy neighbor approach that was going on globally in other economies besides the United States. And then we had a bunch of bad wars and conflicts and the aftermath of the Arab Spring that became the Arab Nightmare, terrorism connected to it. So when you add and you lit those matches and you add an unbelievable global refugee crisis today, the likes we haven't seen in modern history. You know, I have enormous respect for anybody on the refugee front. David Miliband, who knows, maybe he could come back and be the future Prime Minister of the UK, but he's now head of the International Rescue Committee. And when you kind of go through what David is working on, what the portfolios of challenges that they have, or I was just with one of the Mark Whitcock or something. I just interviewed him in Doha, who's responsible for this for the UN, and the unmet need for refugees and how they're being dealt with around the world. Victims of war, victims of conflict, displaced. It's staggeringly tragic, and so that's added on to a time when a lot of people already feel economically squeezed. And why are they helping others when we're not even helping our own? That is the thing that's gone global and viral around the world. And in my view, if I were doing this, and if I were advising the President of the United States or a prospective president. Nearly everybody I know is running for president. Kirsten Gillibrand just announced on the Colbert Show. I'm not sure that's a good place to announce, but Julian Castro. I mean, just everyone's going to run, and so the question is, are they running because of their own vanity and ego, or are they going to go solve that problem for my, let's just take my second and third cousins in the Midwest of the United States who were patriots for the country, who served and gave and believed in internationalism, and today don't. We need to fix that. I interviewed Joe Biden on that Davos trip it was actually the one before the election, before the Hillary Trump race, and he said the Democratic Party had become a party of snobs. I'm the one that put that out there, and said that we've forgotten that. That has to be fixed, those issues and that element of America's social contract, which is also what is Italy's social contract, what is Greece's social contract, what is the social contract in Poland, what are these other places in the world, in France with the yellow vest right now, until we get into solving the tip that all of these economies have made, with all due respect to you hedge fund types in the audience, towards your community in New York, and away from others, and a kind of sustainability in jobs and aspirations, and this in a real way where it's not just fake. We're not going to solve this. It's going to get worse. It goes down to that. That's why people don't have bandwidth for international respect and international investment today. And it's got to be fixed, because the world will become very dark, and we will see a restart of, like the gentleman sitting next to you, not only in the 1930s, and a lot of bad stuff happened in the 30s. You look at the nationalism that the European Union was supposed to sublimate. That's coming back. You can feel it when you're in Austria. You can feel it when you're talking to disaffected groups in Germany. And, I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. The Middle East is going to come apart in weird ways that we haven't talked about tonight. So anyway, sorry to get off that, but you asked a good question. Yes, and is it a yes or no? I'll try.
Sort of.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying about reworking many of these agreements.
Yeah.
And I think the basis of that needs to percolate up is having the diplomats appointed in many of these places that have not been appointed. That can percolate up, because they're on the ground, they're seeing what's going on, they're getting the pulse of that communities and those countries. And why isn't that going on and getting these people appointed? Because that's how we can rework these deals, is be able to get a sense of what they're thinking and understanding.
We need to do it. I'm in total agreement. And the bottom line is that the upper echelons of the supposedly thinking system don't want that feedback. They don't want, right now, for whatever reason, that information to flow up, and they don't care about it. And they're demonstrating that by not prioritizing that. I got asked the same question about the Foreign Service, in Colorado Springs today. It's been decimated. And let's just say, even with all the hurdles that have been going through, if Wendy Sherman were standing up talking to you, or Nick Burns, or Bill Burns, the former Deputy Secretary of State, all of whom have written, Bob Gates, who, Bob Gates supported the Department of State more than any other person out there when he was Secretary of Defense. And, he was the one who suggested Rex Tillerson. And I am confused, to be quite honest, by whether Donald Trump told Rex not to hire anyone, or Rex just did it on his own and camouflaged it around some notion of a big kind of commercial reorganization. But it's criminal what happened in that year and a half. And someday we will see that, written about and to understand it. But the damage has been structural and will be for a very long time. And it's because what you're saying is, we don't need to know about the rest of the world. We don't care about the rest of the world. That's where we are right now. But the problem is, America is still a very powerful country with capacity and intelligence and military operations all around the world. And one of the things that Obama said, whether you liked it or not, but I think it's a true thing, is that America without a strategic course, without a clear vision of what matters and what doesn't, what matters less, not that things don't matter, it runs the risk of all of that apparatus and capacity being hijacked by others for their needs, and us not really being in control of our own capacity, if you will. And I think he's absolutely right. And we're in that situation today because, again, my fundamental criticism of the Trump administration is not that it's a disruptor, not that it makes decisions that a lot of the strategic class in Washington find wrong or incorrect. A lot of them I support. It's the spitting on allies, it's the hugging of enemies or rivals, and it is the absence of a plan that we can all understand. And I just have to tell you, I am a cocktail party guy in D.C. I hang out with all of the president's cabinet. I know or have met virtually all of them. They keep leaving. I was on a lot of, even Ryan Zinke and I were in a theater thing once with a thing called Will on the Hill. It was a mock Shakespeare thing, and I would get to Dr. Ryan Zinke, and I admit that. But you hear things from them, and it was good. And now I'm meeting acting members. But in the process, what's interesting is they themselves don't know where the president is. When H.R. McMaster was his national security advisor, I knew H.R. pretty well, socialized with him and with Wilbur Ross, with other folks. Well, there was one night, I tell you, there was one night, it was very funny. It was party Wilbur Ross had just been confirmed, and Lally Weymouth, who was really responsible for Donald Trump in a lot of ways, but that's a long story. The daughter of Katharine Graham, of Washington Post, was hosting a party for Wilbur, and I was, somehow accidentally invited, so I was there. But I met everybody, and Bob Lighthizer was there. There was a very cool crowd, Elaine Chao. Well, they all went off to dinner, but they forgot to take H.R. McMaster with them. So he was left at the house, and so I said, hey, want to go to Cafe Milano? And I took Senator Joe Manchin in with me as my guest. So Manchin, H.R., and I went to have this fascinating dinner at Milano when his own Republican crowd had neglected and forgotten him. And then Rex Tillerson was calling from Japan, and I know something about Japan, so I was telling him what I would do. But you saw a situation where these guys were completely out of step with where I knew the president was on Japan through other sources. And that is the story, that there is an administration that doesn't know where the president is. And it asks the interesting question of today, when the rest of the world is looking at us, do they look at Congress and listen to Lindsey Graham or John McCain when he was alive, or Dianne Feinstein, or do they listen to Jim Mattis, who was clearly in a different place, or do they listen to President Trump and wait for his tweets? And are those tweets which flip on a dime, depending on which way it goes? So it's created an instability around the world just in communication, regardless of what the policy is, regardless of what you get, and we're not walking along. Yes, I know, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. No, go ahead. I promise. Yeah, yes. I'm
gonna not go.
No.
Aside from the administration, do you have a suggestion how the United States should be dealing with our Latin American neighbors and the problem on the southern border? And
just don't invade Venezuela. We need to get that gentleman over there. I know I'll be real quiet, but this gentleman over on the far, because he's going to get mad at me. The guy the second row, far end. There we go. I saw him working real hard. I would say really quickly on Latin America. Latin America, regrettably, should be a much higher priority for us than it is. We treat it as an afterthought. Even with Obama, when Arturo Valenzuela was the Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs, he says, I'm lucky to get time. I'm lucky to get time on the dock. We have things, that occasionally, the Summit of the Americas that bring us back to take a look at it. But obviously what we're doing to Mexico is weird because our net, migration from Mexico is zero. Mexico has gotten old before it's gotten rich, and so the migration patterns are different. But in the other areas where they've moved the drug wars down further south, that's where the problems are coming from. And like we've seen with Colombia or other places, we sort of know how to work with countries and stabilizing them, basically moving out the bad folks and trying to create investment to keep people there. That should be part of whatever mitigation process we have with migration in the United States, and that is not happening. Because right now, no one, well, at least in the administration, wants that to happen because it's easier to continue to tell the story of bad people coming in the country if we have some bad people coming in the country. So it's interesting that I think if you were to wave a wand and make this all disappear tomorrow by solving this and getting people to go back down to Honduras and Nicaragua and whatnot, I don't think the Trump administration would be very happy because it needs that foil right now. And that is not a good way to to deal with diplomacy in the Latin world. There are a lot of things that we could and should be doing, in my view, that even, again, his own administration would see it to do. And, John Kelly, unfortunately, he is gone now. I think John Kelly will, in the history book, come out, but I think he was working hard to try to get things done this. I think they've now been suspended. I really regret that he is gone, because I think that he actually was working with parts of the administration to get some smarter strategies down. But I don't think it's going to be that. But I knew you had asked a question. I want to make sure we got it.
You've answered a lot of my questions.
Oh, then we don't have to go to you. Yeah.
Quick one. I get a lot of questions from my friends in Europe as to what's going on in the U.S. And
How do you answer?
I was going to ask, how do you answer?
I tell them that we are at an inflection point, that the alliances and relationships are under stress and need to be rethought and redesigned, and we have to not live off the fumes of the past, and we have to reinvent a great relationship. I have editors out there in the world that are not particularly fond of me, that I've been forced to work with. And I go to them and I say, you and I do not have a great track record. They're usually nasty and difficult and obstinate. But I buy a beer or a bottle of sake to go back my Chinese stuff and say, we need to understand that we have to work together, and we've got to invent a good relationship. We have to develop habits of interaction and mutual respect and sort of sort out where we are. And it has almost always worked. That's what we need to do, we and Europe need to do on security and economic policy and immigration issues. But I don't know where the adults are to do that. And I'm looking for them. Again, resumes, if you will. But I think that it's a really important issue. But look, when the President of the European Union and Angela Merkel say we're on our own, we can no longer count on the United States, and they're saying this publicly in forums, they are not inaccurate. I speak every year at the Brussels Forum and interview, one of the major leaders, usually in the Brussels Forum that the German Marshall Fund puts on. And we always get a good contingent of senators. John McCain used to be very dedicated. He would take, Lindsey Graham or Ted Cruz or Ron Johnson or, very interesting folks there. I think Cory Gardner might be going this year, I hope. They would demonstrate the importance and communicate to the Europeans. Yes, I know we have a little bit of noise going on. It's largely for domestic reasons. We still love you and appreciate you and are working with you. That's helpful. If you don't have the executive branch and the White House playing the role it should be, then senators and members of Congress that have BMW plants in their local areas, or they have trade and economic issues, or they've sent their kids abroad, all of those other people and business exchanges matter at a level below the federal, the non-White House federal part of the government and further down. And the Europeans take some stock in that. But I can't tell you how they don't trust us. For a while, the line was, we trust you in military and security issues because those arrangements are structural, issue, and ongoing. And we continue. Now they can't even say that. That's the problem. So, and so you would be kind of, I hate to say this, I'm going to say it, but you'd be bullshitting your friends that tell it all be okay. It's not going to all be okay. It's going to have to be redesigned and rethought and reworked at, because the status quo is going to get worse, and that's just the truth. So might as well embrace it.
Our last question.
Yes.
Right here.
Hello, sir.
Hi. I'll send you my CV.
I saw you put up both hands, right? Yeah.
During the Obama era, why did we not get a coalition together to provide the border countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, with the funds necessary to take care of all of the refugees?
Great question. I would ask the same question. We didn't have it, so I'll take you back into history. I helped organize something that I would love all of you to attend. It used to be called the Washington Ideas Forum. It's now called Atlantic Ideas. A few years back, we had some real drama play out because I had invited John Kerry, Susan Rice, Chuck Hagel, some other mucky-mucks, whoever was head of the CIA, to all speak. They all accepted. They all came in. And Chuck Hagel, whom I liked and respected, and liked the fact that he was somewhat different than many other players, And he, despite being relatively inarticulate, actually is a serious strategist. He needed a better speechwriter and a communicator, but his thinking was sound. And he said, we don't have a strategy on Syria. We have a do-nothing strategy on Syria that is neither realist, nor neoconservative, nor humanitarian and dealing with these other issues. We need to vote where to go, and that President Obama, in his view, was in a situation where the things that he was articulating as aspirational were not being executed in any way. This has, nothing to do. I mean, I think things were contributing, like the chemical weapons attacks, the Red Line, but that was only one piece of it. And so Chuck wrote a still classified memo that I'm trying desperately to FOIA that laid out in incredible detail what a strategy could be that would deal with a lot of these issues, why it wasn't happening, and blamed a lot of this on Susan Rice and the chaotic decision strategy. So I want to be careful with this because Susan's a friend of mine as well, but Susan was not looked at as one of the most organized and consistent national security advisors, and was not someone who necessarily organized the process as smoothly as some of her predecessors might have. And Chuck was highly critical of that. And so this was classified. And so what happened was, to come back to my festival, which is it's all about me, Chuck allowed John Kirby, his then spokesman, to show Mark Landler of the New York Times this classified memo, secretly, just read only. And it made it in the New York Times the day Chuck was speaking at my festival. Susan Rice was speaking the next day. And this design was, memo was designed there. So she came in. Chuck's was sort of, I think she pressed his firing. He was essentially fired, though regrettably by President Obama, who was very respectful to him, unlike President Trump with Mattis. And that was there. So you can go back to that moment and say, I don't know what's in that memo. I don't know if it would have solved the issues in refugees, but I know that Jordan is exploding. When somebody asked me what could be done on refugees, I said, thank every Jordanian you meet. The Jordanians have absorbed the refugees in the Palestine crisis, the Iraq crisis, the Syria crisis, and they get very little global support, just barely to hold on. The Turks have been paid by the Europeans to bring in some, and then you have these horrible, what I think are the equivalent of concentration camps, exploitation camps in North Africa, where these are points of interest in the rapes, the murders, the forced labor camps that are going on among people that are trying to escape harm where they are, and before they're processed in any way into Europe, are frozen there. So it's a nightmare what's happening today, and I think people have blown the whistle, not just during this administration, but previous in Obama. And there was like in any case, the Obama administration, and I think they admit it, was not great on this. And this ulcer was allowed to grow and fester and become far worse. And now, when Angela Merkel was sitting there trying to do what she saw as the right and moral thing in the world, something that very few in the 1930s did. This is a replay to go back to his comment of the 1930s, when migrants and those that are refugees are not being allowed in countries around the world. We've all seen the movies, the ships, the Jews on the ships that were not allowed inside countries. This was a horrific time in our history, but many other countries' histories too. And we don't have a lot to be proud of there. There's so much more I would like to go into. Ebola right now, I don't want to leave you all depressed, but it's fascinating that the second biggest outbreak of Ebola is going on right now in the Congo. No coverage in the United States right now, 0. And so 400 dead, 600 contaminated. This is when you get into the areas we haven't talked about, whether it's climates or pathogens, what's going on and how important it is to have our global health infrastructure out there working and aware. These are things that I think are right now in jeopardy. And so whether you look at Syria, whether you look at Africa, whether you look at even places in the United States with certain kinds of things, a lot of that apparatus is eroding, and we should all be worried about it. So on that optimistic note, I want to thank all of you.